In the first few moments after you wake, before the noise of the world reaches your mind, there is a space of pure direction quietly opening within you. Most people rush past it, without realizing that those first thoughts of the morning begin shaping the emotional and energetic pattern of the entire day ahead. Before your phone, before your memories, before yesterday fully returns, consciousness is already moving. And what you consistently expect during those moments becomes the invisible framework through which your experiences begin unfolding. So listen carefully, because this is not merely motivation. It is a deeper understanding of how inner states quietly influence outer reality. Expectation is not passive wishing. It is not empty optimism. It is not pretending life is perfect, while fear still dominates your inner world. Expectation is a creative orientation of consciousness. It is the emotional assumption that something is already becoming true before physical evidence appears. And the mind, when sustained in a certain assumption long enough, begins organizing perception, behavior, emotion, and experience around that state. This is why your mornings matter more than you realize. Each morning you are not simply waking up to reality. You are entering a field of possibility that responds to the state you occupy. Your assumptions become filters. Your expectations become instructions. Your inner atmosphere becomes the lens through which the world is interpreted. Two people can walk through the exact same circumstances and experience completely different realities because one expects limitation while the other expects unfolding. One looks for struggle and unconsciously finds it everywhere. The other assumes alignment, opportunity, movement, and growth, and life begins reflecting that expectation back in subtle ways. Because the world often mirrors the state you repeatedly inhabit. And this is where transformation truly begins, not first in action, not first in external change, but in assumption, in the quiet inner decision to expect differently. Most people are conditioned to wake up already identified with old stories. They immediately remember problems, disappointments, fears, delays, frustrations, and limitations. Before the day even begins, they have already re-entered the emotional identity of yesterday, and then they wonder why life keeps repeating itself. But what if each morning became something different? What if instead of returning automatically to old patterns, you deliberately entered the feeling of a new reality before the world had a chance to define your mood? What if you stopped treating mornings as routine and started treating them as creative thresholds? Because they are. The first moments of awareness are powerful because the mind is still impressionable. The emotional tone you establish early begins influencing perception throughout the day. What you focus on expands in psychological importance. What you emotionally rehearse begins shaping expectation. And expectation influences behavior, interpretation, and energy in ways most people never consciously notice. This is why attention matters. Attention is creative. What you repeatedly return to mentally becomes familiar, and what becomes familiar eventually starts feeling true. So if your attention constantly returns to fear, your nervous system begins expecting fear. If your attention constantly returns to struggle, your mind becomes trained to notice struggle everywhere. But if your attention begins returning daily to possibility, confidence, peace, abundance, clarity, and alignment, a different internal pattern slowly forms. And that pattern changes how reality is experienced. You begin noticing opportunities you once ignored. Conversations feel more meaningful. Ideas arrive more naturally. Synchronicities become easier to recognize. What once felt blocked begins feeling fluid. Not because the universe suddenly changed overnight, but because your inner state changed first. And once your inner state changes consistently, your relationship to reality changes with it. This is the deeper meaning behind assumption. Assumption is the feeling of something being real internally before it fully appears externally. And when an assumption is repeated with emotional consistency, the subconscious mind begins accepting it as natural. Once something feels natural within you, your thoughts, reactions, posture, decisions, and emotional responses begin aligning with it automatically. This is why identity matters so much. Your life tends to organize itself around the version of yourself you believe yourself to be. If you see yourself as unsupported, life often feels difficult and isolating. If you see yourself as unlucky, your attention unconsciously filters for disappointment. If you identify with delay, life begins feeling like endless waiting. But when you begin assuming that life is moving in your favor, that opportunities are unfolding, that things are aligning even before evidence appears, something subtle begins shifting in your entire way of being. You become calmer, more receptive, more open, less reactive. You stop forcing, you stop chasing, You stop collapsing emotionally every time circumstances temporarily fail to match desire. And instead, a quiet certainty begins developing inside you. Not certainty based on evidence, certainty based on inner alignment. This is not blind positivity, it is disciplined awareness. Because the conditioned mind will constantly try to return to familiar emotional patterns. Doubt will revisit you. Fear will try to reclaim authority. Old assumptions will whisper that nothing is changing. But every moment gives you another opportunity to choose again, to assume differently again, to return to the state you actually want to inhabit. This is the real practice, not forcing reality, not controlling every outcome, but consciously returning your awareness to the state you wish to embody, again and again, until it becomes natural. Because repetition builds identity, and identity shapes experience. Most people underestimate how powerfully they are influenced by the emotional atmosphere they carry each day. Your expectations quietly influence your interpretation of events. They affect how you respond to uncertainty. They shape what you notice and what you ignore. If you expect rejection, neutral situations begin feeling personal. If you expect failure, temporary setbacks feel final. But if you expect growth, even difficulties begin appearing as movement rather than punishment. This changes everything. Because your emotional reality is often shaped less by events themselves and more by the meaning your assumptions assign to them. And this is why expectation becomes so important. Expectation is not simply waiting for something good to happen. Expectation is the inner agreement that reality is already moving in a certain direction before you can fully see it. When that expectation stabilizes, life begins feeling different. Time feels different. Delays feel less threatening. You stop interpreting every pause as failure. You begin sensing that things are unfolding beyond immediate visibility. And this creates a deeper form of confidence. Not confidence rooted in control. Confidence rooted in trust. Trust in the unseen movement of life. Trust in your inner direction. Trust that what you continue nurturing internally is gradually shaping external experiences. This is why your mornings are sacred whether you realize it or not. Because before the world pulls your attention outward, you have an opportunity to establish your state consciously. You can begin your day from stress, or from peace, from fear, or from expectation, from reaction, or from creation. And over time, the state you repeatedly return to becomes your dominant identity. That identity then influences the choices you make without conscious effort. This is why inner conversations matter. The words you silently repeat throughout the day are not harmless. They reinforce emotional states. They strengthen identity. They shape expectation. If your internal dialogue constantly says nothing ever works out for me, your nervous system begins preparing for disappointment automatically. But when your inner dialogue changes, your internal chemistry begins changing with it. You begin carrying yourself differently, thinking differently, responding differently, and eventually experiencing differently. So every morning, before the world enters your awareness completely, choose carefully what you impress upon your mind. Do not immediately rehearse problems. Do not immediately surrender your attention to fear. Do not immediately react to old conditions. Pause, breathe, and deliberately enter the feeling of the reality you wish to experience. Feel peace before evidence. Feel gratitude before results. Feel confidence before certainty appears externally. Feel supported before circumstances prove it. Because your subconscious responds more deeply to feeling than logic, and sustained feeling becomes expectation. Expectation becomes identity, and identity quietly shapes reality. As this understanding deepens, you begin noticing something profound. Life starts feeling less random, less chaotic, less disconnected. You begin sensing that your inner world and outer experience are not separate processes but reflections of one another. Your assumptions affect perception. Perception affects emotion. Emotion affects behavior. Behavior affects experience. And experience then reinforces the assumptions you continue carrying, which means the cycle can either imprison you or transform you depending on what you repeatedly identify with. This is why awareness matters. The moment you become aware of your assumptions, you reclaim the ability to choose them consciously. You stop living entirely by unconscious conditioning. You stop allowing old emotional patterns to dictate your future automatically. You begin directing attention intentionally. And intention changes experience. Not always instantly, not always dramatically, but consistently, quietly, powerfully. Over time, expectation begins feeling less like a practice and more like a way of being. You no longer need constant external reassurance because your stability comes from within. You stop demanding immediate proof. You stop obsessing over timing. You stop interpreting every delay as denial. Instead, you move through life with a quieter confidence. You begin trusting that unseen movement is still movement. That what is held consistently in consciousness gradually expresses itself outwardly. And from this state, even uncertainty feels different, not threatening. Open, creative, alive with possibility. Because you understand that reality is more responsive than you once believed. And this changes the way you walk through your days. You become less reactive to appearances, less emotionally controlled by temporary circumstances, more grounded, more observant, more intentional. And in that state, life often begins responding in unexpected ways. Opportunities appear naturally. People arrive unexpectedly. Ideas connect at the right time. Conversations shift direction. What once felt impossible starts feeling inevitable. Not because you forced reality into submission, but because you aligned internally with a different assumption. And that assumption slowly became your atmosphere. This is the hidden power of expectation. It is not merely changing what you experience. It is changing who you become while experiencing it. Because every sustained expectation carries an identity within it. The person who expects struggle becomes a different version of themselves than the person who expects growth. The person who expects rejection lives differently than the person who expects alignment. So ultimately, this work is not only about changing external circumstances, it is about becoming someone new internally, someone calmer, more centered, more trusting, more aware, more aligned. And this transformation begins in the simplest place imaginable, the first moments of your morning, the moment before memory fully returns, the moment before the world tells you who you are, the moment where you can still choose consciously. So tomorrow morning, before you reach for distraction, before you revisit yesterday, before you surrender your awareness to old patterns, remember this: your expectation is shaping the emotional architecture of your reality. Your attention is directing energy. Your assumptions are influencing experience. And the state you repeatedly occupy is quietly becoming your life. So choose your state carefully. Choose your assumptions deliberately. Choose your inner atmosphere consciously. And return daily to the feeling of the life you wish to embody. Not because you are escaping reality, but because reality often unfolds in response to the consciousness through which it is perceived. And as you continue practicing this, patiently and consistently, you may begin to notice something extraordinary. The world outside begins reflecting the shift that first occurred within.